The Halloween you celebrate, the one with cute costumes and fun-sized candy bars, is a pale, sanitized shadow of what it used to be. The original holiday was a chaotic mix of citywide vandalism that overwhelmed the police, drug-induced hallucinations that created the myth of flying witches, and bizarre dating rituals involving cabbages. We're about to peel back the plastic wrapper to expose 32 reasons why the historical version of Halloween was infinitely more dangerous, absurd, and frankly, insane. 1. During the bleakest years of the Great Depression, when the average family considered a new pair of shoes a major luxury, store-bought Halloween costumes were pure fantasy. But American kids, resilient as ever, created some of the most genuinely terrifying masks in history using literal garbage. Imagine this. You take an old, stained burlap sack that once held potatoes or flour, cut 2 jagged holes for eyes, and maybe smear some charcoal from the stove to make a crude mouth. The result wasn't a cute, crafty project. It was the stuff of nightmares. These unsettling, blank-faced sack masks became an iconic symbol of the era, a perfect reflection of the grim reality outside. It proved that true horror doesn't come from expensive latex and special effects, but from the unsettling simplicity of poverty and the eerie void of a featureless face staring at you from the dark. 2. You literally couldn't write a more perfect ending for the world's greatest escape artist. On October 31st, 1926, the one and only Harry Houdini died, making Halloween his permanent anniversary. The official cause was a ruptured appendix following a surprise punch he hadn't braced for. A dramatic end for a dramatic man. Now, Houdini had spent a huge chunk of his career exposing fraudulent spiritualists and mediums, so he was obsessed with the afterlife. He made a solemn pact with his wife Bess, promising that if human consciousness could survive death, he would contact her using a secret code. For 10 long years after he passed, every single Halloween, Bess held a seance, sitting in the dark, desperately waiting for that one final message. It never arrived, forever cementing Houdini as the master of escape who couldn't pick that one ultimate lock. 3. That cozy, cheerful bonfire you associate with autumn nights and toasted marshmallows has some seriously grim and, frankly, metal origins. The term bonfire is a direct contraction of bonefire, and our ancestors took that name with chilling literalness. During the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain, a precursor to Halloween, Druid priests would construct absolutely colossal pyres. And what did they use for fuel? The actual bones of slaughtered cattle. This wasn't a party. It was a deeply spiritual ritual. Casting the skeletons into the massive flames was an act of purification, and the billowing smoke was believed to cleanse the community and ward off evil spirits. So the next time you're enjoying that crackling warmth, just remember you're participating in a tradition that began as a gigantic, blazing pyre of burning skeletons. 4. After World War II ended and sugar rationing was finally lifted, Halloween in America was on life support. But an unlikely savior swooped in. Big candy. Before the war, kids were mostly given homemade treats like cookies, popcorn balls, or even fruit. But candy corporations saw a golden opportunity for a complete market takeover. They launched a massive nationwide advertising blitz, relentlessly pushing the idea that commercially produced, individually wrapped candies were the superior choice. They framed it as a matter of hygiene, safety, and convenience. The campaign was a phenomenal success, transforming a holiday of community and homemade crafts into a multi-billion-dollar commercial juggernaut, forever linking Halloween not with ghosts or spirits, but with the mass consumption of brand-name chocolate bars. 5. If you think modern dating is weird, allow me to introduce you to Victorian-era apple peeling. This was a popular party game for young, single women, and it was basically a bizarre, fruit-based form of divination. The rules were strict. A woman had to peel an apple in one continuous, unbroken strand. If the peel snapped, the spell was broken, and she was clearly destined to be alone forever. If she managed this feat of dexterity, she would then swing the long peel around her head 3 times and let it fall to the floor. Everyone would then gather around the resulting pile of fruit skin and try to decipher what letter it had formed. That letter was supposed to be the first initial of her future husband. It was the 19th century equivalent of swiping right, but with way more pressure and a much higher chance of just ending up with a sticky mess on the floor. 6. The seemingly innocent phrase trick or treat was not always the polite sing-song question it is today. When it first appeared in print in a 1927 Canadian newspaper, it was presented as a barely veiled threat. The article detailed how local youths, or geysers, were operating what amounted to a miniature protection racket. The phrase was an ultimatum, not a choice. The unspoken agreement was clear. You either provide the treat in the form of candy or coins, or you will be subjected to a trick, which in those days meant anything from soaping your windows to tipping over your outhouse. It was a festive form of extortion, a night where the social order was flipped, and for a few hours homeowners had to pay a tribute to roving gangs of children just to ensure their property remained intact until morning. 7. In the 1970s and early 80s, a terrifying urban legend hijacked Halloween, creating a full-blown national panic known as Halloween sadism. Fueled by sensationalist media reports, the story spread like wildfire. Depraved, anonymous psychos in quiet suburbs were hiding razor blades, pins, and poison in candy to harm innocent children. The fear became so intense that it fundamentally changed the holiday. Parents meticulously inspected every single piece of candy, and some hospitals even offered free X-ray services to scan kids' loot bags. The strangest part? It was almost entirely a myth. Sociological studies later found virtually no credible instances of strangers randomly poisoning trick-or-treaters. The panic was a textbook example of mass hysteria, where the fear of a non-existent threat became far more dangerous than the threat itself. 8. Forget about elaborate latex masks and Hollywood-quality costumes. For centuries in Ireland and Scotland, the original home of guising, the go-to method for disguising yourself on Halloween, was beautifully simple and incredibly effective. You just smeared your face with soot. Kids and adults would reach into a cold fireplace or chimney, scrape out a handful of the black powder, and rub it all over their faces. The goal wasn't to look like a specific monster or character. It was to achieve complete and total anonymity. This practice transformed a person from a familiar neighbor into a featureless, shadowy creature of the night, effectively erasing their identity so they could blend in with the spirits and mischievous beings believed to roam the earth on that one chaotic night of the year. 9. It's tough to grasp now, but in the 1920s and 30s, Halloween in some major American cities wasn't just pranks, it was full-blown urban warfare, and the authorities were losing. We're not talking about a few soaped windows. We're talking about thousands of teenagers organizing citywide riots of pure chaos. Newspaper archives from the time read like dispatches from a war zone, detailing mobs of young men who would systematically derail streetcars, smash hundreds of shop windows in a single night, start massive bonfires in the middle of busy intersections, and even gleefully overturn automobiles. The police were often so completely outnumbered and overwhelmed that their only option was to fall back and try to contain the pandemonium. For one night a year, these cities were effectively held hostage by Halloween lawlessness, a problem so severe it forced leaders to invent organized trick-or-treating as a citywide bribe to buy some peace. 10. When the first European settlers landed in America, they brought their cultural baggage with them. But Halloween was one tradition that got a very cold reception. The holiday's first and most powerful enemies in the New World were, unsurprisingly, the Puritans of New England. With their famously strict and joy-averse brand of Protestantism, they looked at Halloween and its folk rituals with extreme prejudice. To them, the bonfires, fortune-telling games, and costumes weren't just harmless fun. They were remnants of paganism, and at worst, a direct invitation to Satan himself. They actively worked to suppress any and all such festivities, effectively making Halloween an illegal holiday in their colonies. It wasn't until the massive waves of Irish and Scottish immigrants arrived in the 19th century that the holiday was finally reintroduced and began its slow, centuries-long crawl toward mainstream acceptance. 11. While you probably haven't thought about it, a fierce and surprisingly petty rivalry has been raging for decades over the title of Halloween Capital of the World. On one side, you have Anoka, Minnesota. They hold a strong historical claim, having hosted one of the very first citywide Halloween parades back in 1920, specifically created to stop kids from vandalizing everything in sight. They even hold the official United States trademark for the title. But every October, their claim is unofficially challenged by the heavyweight champion of spooky, Salem, Massachusetts. Leaning heavily into its dark history with the 1692 witch trials, Salem transforms into a Halloween mecca for an entire month, drawing hundreds of thousands of tourists to its Haunted Happenings festival. So while Anoka has the legal paperwork, Salem's global reputation makes it the undisputed people's champ in this bizarre annual showdown. 12. Before the friendly, round orange pumpkin became the face of Halloween, the original jack-o'-lanterns were carved from turnips and potatoes, and they were pure, unadulterated nightmare fuel. Forget the cute, smiling faces you see today. The Irish and Scottish would take these gnarled, pale, almost flesh-like root vegetables and carve twisted, demonic, and tormented expressions into them. Then, they'd place a lump of glowing coal inside, causing the grotesque features to flicker menacingly in the darkness. This wasn't a festive decoration, it was a supernatural security system. These terrifying heads were designed to scare away the wandering spirit of Stingy Jack, a legendary trickster so vile that, after being barred from heaven, he was also personally kicked out of hell by the devil. These turnip monsters were a clear, terrifying message. Jack, go haunt someone else's house. 13. The modern, seemingly innocent tradition of trick or treat was actually invented as a desperate form of citywide vandalism insurance. In the early 20th century, especially during the Great Depression, Halloween in America had descended into a night of rampant, destructive chaos often called Mischief Night. It was a massive headache for communities. Teenagers and young men would treat the night as a free-for-all, roaming the streets to overturn cars, smash windows, and generally cause mayhem. Frustrated and unable to stop the destruction, city leaders and community groups devised a brilliant new strategy: organized bribery. They started promoting official trick-or-treat events, basically paying kids off with candy to keep them too busy to cause trouble. The deal was simple. Homeowners offered a sweet tribute to prevent their property from being vandalized before sunrise. 14. During the 19th century, Halloween underwent a bizarre and fascinating transformation, shifting from a night of ancient Celtic terror into what was essentially the Victorian version of a singles mixer. In a society bound by incredibly rigid social rules that kept young men and women apart, Halloween became one of the most important matchmaking events on the calendar. The entire holiday was re-engineered around romance and courtship. Lavish parties were thrown, filled with fortune-telling games and rituals, all obsessively focused on one single question: who are you going to marry? So while the spooky, supernatural aesthetic of ghosts and ghouls remained, it was applied to a much more immediate kind of fear: the chilling terror of ending up alone. It was less about warding off ancient demons and more about surviving the Victorian dating scene. 15. Forget bobbing for apples. At a proper Victorian Halloween party, you might be served a slice of something called a fate cake, which was basically an edible oracle that could predict your entire future. This wasn't just a dessert. It was a game of high-stakes culinary roulette. Baked inside the cake were several small trinkets, and the object you found in your slice was a direct prophecy for the coming year. If you got a ring, congratulations, you were getting married. If you found a coin, you were about to come into some money. But if you bit down on a thimble, it was a social death sentence, a clear sign you were destined for a life of lonely spinsterhood. You can just imagine the sheer, nail-biting tension in the room as everyone took that first bite, praying for a wedding band and dreading the sad metallic click of a thimble. 16. While we now see pumpkins as the perfect canvas for carving spooky faces, back in the Victorian era, a pumpkin could also serve as a very clever party invitation. Instead of sending a formal written card, it became a whimsical and fashionable trend in some circles to have a whole, uncarved pumpkin delivered to a friend's doorstep. This wasn't some random act of autumnal generosity. It was a very specific and festive signal that you were officially invited to their Halloween party. It was a charming, almost conspiratorial way to communicate, turning the gourd itself into a symbol not of horror, but of an exclusive upcoming social event. This small tradition represented a larger shift in the holiday's meaning, from a night of ancient dread to a more lighthearted celebration of community, fun, and, of course, matchmaking. 17. In one of the most bizarre yet consistent trends in American politics, Halloween has become a surprisingly accurate election predictor. For decades, a strange phenomenon known as the mask poll has held true. The candidate whose Halloween mask sells the most units almost always wins the presidential election. This isn't some complex scientific survey. It's a raw, commercial measure of public consciousness, a vote cast with dollars at a costume shop. Whether it reflects genuine popularity, sheer notoriety, or simply which politician has a more cartoonishly fun face to wear to a party, the results have been shockingly reliable. It suggests that on some weird, subconscious level, the American electorate's choice for the leader of the free world is deeply intertwined with who they'd rather dress up as for a night of drunken revelry and candy consumption. 18. For a holiday that has become so inextricably linked to one specific giant squash, the Great Pumpkin Shortage of 2011 was a national crisis. Due to an unusually wet season and widespread flooding, particularly in the northeastern United States, pumpkin crops were absolutely decimated right before their peak season. Panic ensued. News reports fanned the flames of a potential jack-o'-lantern, less Halloween, sending families scrambling to find any suitable gourd for carving. Prices for the few available pumpkins skyrocketed, and many farms that relied on the seasonal rush were left with muddy, empty fields. It was a strange and jarring reminder of how an entire beloved cultural tradition had become precariously dependent on a single, weather-sensitive agricultural product. And for a few tense weeks, the entire holiday felt like it was on the verge of collapse. 19. If you think swiping through dating apps is a strange way to find a partner, it has absolutely nothing on the old Scottish Halloween tradition of cabbage-based divination. Here's how it worked. A young single woman would be blindfolded and sent stumbling into a dark garden with the task of pulling up the first cabbage she touched. This wasn't for a salad. This was a detailed analysis of her future husband. The length and shape of the stalk predicted his height and figure. The amount of dirt still clinging to the root system indicated his potential wealth. And in the most bizarre twist, the actual taste of the dirt was said to reveal his personality and temperament. You have to wonder how many relationships started with the phrase, "Well, his cabbage stalk was a bit crooked, but the dirt tasted surprisingly sweet." 20. The widespread urban legend about anonymous psychos poisoning Halloween candy is almost entirely a myth, but it has a horrifyingly real origin. The entire national panic can be traced back to one man, Ronald Clark O'Brien. In 1974, this Texas father murdered his own 8-year-old son by giving him a cyanide-laced pixie sticks. To cover his tracks, he also gave poisoned candy to his daughter and 3 other children, hoping to create the illusion of a random madman. His motive was pure evil and greed. He was deeply in debt and had taken out a massive life insurance policy on his kids. He was caught, convicted, and eventually executed. The media frenzy around this single, horrific case of a father murdering his son is what created the template for the enduring, yet mostly false myth that faceless strangers are the real threat on Halloween. 21. As if the cabbage pulling wasn't stressful enough, another Victorian Halloween divination game involved a terrifying tete-a-tete with the Grim Reaper. The ritual required a young woman to go into a completely dark room, alone, with only a candle and an apple. She was to sit and stare intently into a mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of her future husband's face appearing over her shoulder. But there was a horrifying catch. According to the legend, if instead of a handsome suitor, She saw the reflection of a skull. It was a deadly omen. It meant she was destined to die before she ever had the chance to marry. It was the ultimate game of romantic Russian roulette, a high-stakes version of Bloody Mary, where you either saw your soulmate or a terrifying premonition of your own early demise. 22. While many presidents have acknowledged Halloween, it was First Lady Mamie Eisenhower who first threw the White House doors wide open to the spirit of the holiday in 1958. She was the first to go all out and fully decorate the entire presidential residence for a massive Halloween party. She completely ditched the usual prim and proper decor, transforming the stately mansion into a haunted house extravaganza. Skeletons were hung in the grand foyers, jack-o'-lanterns grinned from every table, and she even had witches on broomsticks suspended from the ornate chandeliers in the state dining room. The party was held for the children of the White House staff, creating a sense of spooky fun that was a world away from the typical political galas. Her festive efforts set a precedent that nearly every First Lady has followed since. 23. During World War II, Halloween in the United States essentially went on an involuntary hiatus. The biggest culprit was the nationwide rationing of sugar. Sugar was a critical resource for the war effort, needed for everything from feeding troops to producing industrial alcohol. The government imposed strict rationing, which meant that the average household had barely enough sugar for basic needs like baking or sweetening their coffee. The idea of handing out handfuls of candy to every child in the neighborhood was simply out of the question. As a result, the relatively new tradition of trick-or-treating, which had been gaining massive popularity, came to a dead stop. The holiday wasn't completely erased, but the candy-fueled door-to-door aspect was officially put on hold for the duration of the war. 24. That iconic image of a witch soaring through the night sky on a broomstick has less to do with magic and more to do with getting astronomically high on medieval psychedelics. The legend originates from a very real and very dangerous practice involving a hallucinogenic salve known as a flying ointment. Witches and folk healers would brew a potent paste from psychoactive plants like belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. The problem was ingesting these was often lethal. However, they discovered that the compounds could be absorbed much more safely through mucous membranes. So they would coat a staff or a broom handle with the ointment and straddle it. The resulting psychedelic trip was so powerful, it induced vivid sensations of flying, levitation, and astral projection. So, they weren't literally airborne. They were sitting at home, completely out of their minds. 25. Here's a tradition that perfectly captures the bizarre intersection of the supernatural and extreme politeness. In parts of Germany, it was customary for families to hide all of their knives on Halloween night before they went to sleep. This wasn't a security measure to prevent vengeful spirits from using the blades against them. It was the exact opposite. They hid the knives to protect the ghosts. The belief was that the spirits of departed relatives would return home for a visit, and the family didn't want them to accidentally get hurt by bumping into a sharp object in the dark. It's a wonderfully strange mix of spooky and hospitable, fully acknowledging your house is teeming with the undead, but your number one priority is their personal safety. You'd think a being who can phase through walls would be fine, but they were taking no chances. 26. The very first reason humans ever wore costumes on Halloween had absolutely nothing to do with looking cute, getting a laugh, or scoring a mountain of candy. It was a deadly serious act of survival, a desperate attempt to fool actual demons. The ancient Celts believed that on the night of Samhain, the barrier between our world and the spirit world dissolved, allowing a horde of malevolent ghosts and ghouls to roam the earth. To avoid being identified as a tasty, possessable human and dragged off to the netherworld, people would disguise themselves in the most horrifying ways imaginable. They would don terrifying masks carved from wood and drape themselves in the hides and even the heads of slaughtered animals, all in an effort to blend in with the evil spirits. It was the ultimate form of supernatural camouflage, a grim strategy to simply make it through the night alive. 27. In the early 20th century, long before modern safety regulations, Halloween was a public menace and a massive fire hazard just waiting to happen. The holiday was a perfect storm of extreme flammability and open flames. Children's costumes were almost always homemade from the most combustible materials you can imagine, like thin paper, crepe paper streamers, and loose cotton. Now combine that with the universal tradition of putting a lit candle inside every single jack-o'-lantern on every porch. The result was a recipe for absolute disaster. Newspapers from that era are filled with horrifying accounts of children's costumes instantly going up in flames, leading to severe burns and, in some tragic cases, death. It was so common that fire departments had to issue annual public warnings, begging parents to use a flashlight and fireproof their kids. 28. According to old British folklore, Halloween was a very busy night for the devil, but not for the reasons you'd think. He wasn't out tempting souls or causing chaos. He was apparently spending his evening performing his annual nut harvest. Yes, Satan, the Prince of Darkness, was believed to be out gathering hazelnuts. Because of this bizarre satanic link, nuts became a central tool for fortune-telling, especially for couples wanting to test their relationship. A pair would place 2 nuts on a fire grate, one for each of them. If the nuts roasted quietly side by side, it signified a long and happy union. But if they hissed, cracked, and violently popped away from each other, it was a terrible omen, predicting a future of bitter arguments and a messy breakup. It was the original and far more explosive relationship compatibility test. 29. The bogeyman, that shapeless, universal monster parents have used for centuries to scare children into behaving, might have his origins in a very real and very frightening profession. One compelling theory suggests the name evolved from the bugsmen of medieval England. These weren't supernatural creatures. They were crown tax collectors, notorious for their ruthless and intimidating tactics that could ruin a family. They were figures of genuine, tangible fear. An alternative theory ties the name to Scottish boggarts, which were malevolent household spirits known for causing milk to spoil and things to go missing. So whether he was an overly aggressive government agent or a paranormal pest, the bogeyman was born from very real anxieties, a catch-all name for the frightening things that cause trouble in the dark, both financially and supernaturally. 30. The modern American tradition of trick-or-treat is a direct descendant of a much older and far more pious European practice known as souling. Centuries ago in Britain and Ireland, on what they called All Souls' Day, the poor and their children would participate in a door-to-door ritual. They would knock on the doors of wealthier families and offer to say prayers for the souls of their dead relatives who were believed to be trapped in purgatory. In exchange for this vital spiritual service, the household would give them soul cakes, small spiced cakes, often marked with a cross. It was a respectful, solemn transaction. You provide a prayer to help my ancestor's soul, and I provide you with food. It established the door-to-door model, but the currency was piety, not a thinly veiled threat to egg someone's house. 31. While most of our modern Halloween traditions are focused on warding off evil and keeping spirits out of the house, the ancient Celts were far more hospitable. In fact, they would literally set the dinner table for their ghosts. During the festival of Samhain, it was believed that the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest, allowing the spirits of their ancestors to return home for one night. To show their respect and make them feel welcome, families would set an extra place at the table, complete with a full plate of food and a glass of whatever they were drinking. It was a profound act of remembrance, treating their departed relatives not as terrifying phantoms to be feared, but as honored guests who were simply coming home for a family dinner. It was a beautiful gesture that saw the supernatural not as an invasion, but as a reunion. 32. Long before we had ghost hunting TV shows with their electromagnetic field meters and thermal cameras, people had a much simpler and arguably creepier method for detecting a supernatural presence. They watched a candle. According to a widespread piece of old folklore, if you were in a room on Halloween night and the flame of a candle suddenly sputtered and turned a distinct blue color, it was considered an unmistakable sign that a ghost was in the room with you. This wasn't just explained away as a draft or a chemical impurity. the specific color change was seen as definitive proof of a visitor from beyond the grave. You can just imagine the bone-chilling effect that would have. A group of people huddled in the dark telling stories, when the candle's warm yellow flame suddenly shifts to an eerie spectral blue, instantly plunging the room into terrified silence. From turnip demons to knife-hiding Germans, it's clear we've traded genuine historical weirdness for sterile corporate fun. But history is a deep and bizarre well. We've given you 32 facts, but what's the one local, forgotten, or downright insane Halloween tradition from your hometown or country that we were too ignorant to find? Unleash the forgotten histories in the comments below. And if we successfully scrambled your understanding of this holiday, show no mercy to that like button and subscribe for your next dose of historical truth.